Now, Adrian Hill is a mother of two sons and one daughter, two of whom were diagnosed with Tourette syndrome and several associated disorders. She is a retired high school mathematics teacher who was an in-service provider and national trainer for Tourette Canada for 13 years. She has extensive experience doing in-services for teachers and support staff, students, and community members to bring understanding about and strategies for coping with Tourette syndrome and associated disorders. Please begin. Adrian, when you're ready.
All right, thank you so much. Let me share my screen then. And here we go. Hopefully everybody sees that okay. See that all right? Excellent.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, I'm just gonna open that up like so and move you guys over here. All right, perfect. All right, welcome. So as Julian said, today's webinar is going to be specifically about individual program plans for parents of children with Tourette syndrome and OCD and how to communicate effectively. Now, it's not just Tourette syndrome and OCD, it could be ADHD, anything else, but because we're the Tourette OCD Alberta Network, we kind of focus in on those too. So today I'm going to be discussing these plans, and they have a lot of different names you might encounter. And remember that every student will be different with different needs. Hopefully you can effectively transfer my ideas to fit your child's IPP, or at least learn you have a resource to connect and can contact if you need help with your IPP at the Tourette OCD Alberta Network through Julian. And so I'm going to be going through some examples, and then at the very end, I am going to cover something called the Moore lawsuit, and you'll see why that's relevant. So here are some very common names across Canada, across the world, that you may encounter, and they all mean the same thing. IPP is Individual Program Plan. That's Alberta Public. It's also in California. Individual Educational Plan, that's British Columbia and New Zealand. And Learning Support Plan is something that they use for Alberta separate. And this is just a small sampling, and there's more variations that exist, but this is enough for today. And just be aware that if you Google search just IPP, you're going to get some strange things. For example, when I did British Columbia IPP, you get the independent power producers. So if you're looking for your area or looking for information, be sure to type the words out. So if you do British Columbia Individual Program Plan, you will actually get to the government website that talks about what the policies are. Or because I used to teach in British Columbia, I knew it was an IEP or educational plan, and then you will get the right thing. So be aware that it may be a little difficult to search for if you're looking for information. And before I really get into the details of what an IPP looks like and what is a good or versus bad one, I want to go over a common misconception that I have heard, mostly by junior high teachers for some reason, not sure why that is. And teachers will state that in later years, accommodations will be fewer or even non-existent to the student. And they need to work without accommodation as soon as possible. And this is blatantly not true. All three of my kids had accommodations ranging from extra time to separate rooms for examinations, extensions for homework, to having a safe place to have a meltdown if needed. And I have been a reader and a scribe for grade 12 diploma exams and have had friends who worked at the University of Calgary and Mount Royal University who offered these and other accommodations for students. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that students and parents should not work towards minimizing accommodations while working with professionals. Ideally, that is the goal. But when dealing with Tourette syndrome and OCD and all the associated disorders, the progress can be slow and accommodations may still be needed into adulthood. And I'm going to talk more to that in a little bit. Today, I'm going to speak mostly about Alberta specifically, but be aware other provinces and countries also have similar policies. My middle son had extra time provisions while getting his PhD in California. And I want to just go over something that is on the Alberta Learning website. And this is from something called the Inclusive Education page. It says that we need to support children and students in attaining the goals as stated in the Ministerial Order on Student Learning. School authorities must ensure that all children and students, regardless of race, religious belief, color, gender, gender identity, gender expression, physical disability, mental disability, family status, or sexual orientation, or any other factors, have access to meaningful and relevant learning experiences that include appropriate instructional supports. And it does have it in brackets, kindergarten to grade 12, but they have a separate document for post-secondary. So these rules still apply to post-secondary. And I highly recommend that everyone look at this particular document. Take a photo of this if you want to look at it yourself. The reason I'm not going to post it here, it's 572 pages long, but it is really good. It has a whole bunch of really great information about accommodation ideas, assessments for behavioral and academic issues, including math and reading. And I'm going to be talking about what I think are a few of the most important aspects for parents today. Obviously, I can't cover all 572 pages. So take a picture and you can always look at this extensive document, and it has a great search within the document. So if you want something specific and you're looking for something specific, you don't have to read the whole thing. And it provides information for parents as well as students and teachers. And it also has sample IPPs that are both blank and filled in, and they're aimed at early childhood education to high school. So it will help you to see what a good IPP looks like if you're still unsure at the end of this at the end of this presentation. And there's also a separate document for post-secondary, and it's essentially the same, but more of a summary, not as extensive. You will also find types of assessments, which are really important in getting a good IP going, that the school can perform to measure baselines and growth, because that's so important in an IPP. And a really interesting aspect is that they have something called the Getting Along with Others inventory. And it's extensive. It's an extensive checklist that might be helpful to young people with Tourette syndrome and OCD who often have difficulty with social situations. It's good for looking at ideas for what needs to be worked on. However, it is very extensive, and if you try to implement too many of these, it may be overwhelming for the students. So just be aware of that. If used correctly and carefully, it could be a very useful tool. So just be aware of that. And there's a lot more because it's so long, 572 pages. And one last chance, if you want to take a picture of the screen, there is where you get this document. Now I'm going to briefly talk about how all provinces really do have these things in effect. So if you're not from Alberta, you can still find these kinds of documents. And I'm going to tell you something that happened within this last year. A neurologist from Fredericton reached out to Julian about a school not providing accommodations for a student with tics. The student was asked to hold them in, and there were no tic breaks allowed and no additional support in the form of a teacher's aide, despite recommendations for these accommodations. So Julian reached out to me, and I found these two documents. So one is called the Guidelines and Standards, Educational Planning for Students with Diverse Learning Needs. And one was from the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission, which were guidelines on accommodating students with a disability K-12. And apparently things did get better for the students. So it's really important to understand what your province is really expecting from schools. Now, some private schools, I'm going to talk very briefly about this, they do not have to follow the provincial programs of studies and don't do IPPs. But I would like to show you something. This is from Alberta, and I'm sure every province has something like this. What is stated on page 22 of the Alberta Learning Individualized Program Planning document from 2006 It says, while educators have a professional obligation to participate in the IPP process, there is also an ethical obligation to do not only what is required, but also what is right for each student. And I think that ethical part should apply to all teachers, whether they're in a public or private setting. So from the alberta.ca site, there is a brief document, which is 10 pages, which is all about individual plans. And the first line of the page reads, individual program plans are required for all students with special needs, including those with learning disabilities. I think I have made my case that an IPP is something the government expects schools to do. Now let's look at how to make a good IPP. The very first thing we need to do is to identify the needs. And they need to be specific, not general. We don't want to say we want them to behave better. That's just way too general. And how do we get these identifying needs? Well, first of all, a psychoeducational assessment by a registered psychologist is a fantastic idea. Unfortunately, this can be very expensive. It can be done through the public schools, but there's usually a wait list of about 2 years, though it can be done privately, and medical insurance can cover all or part of this cost. So you should check that out. I did have my kids have the assessment about every 5 to 7 years as they were going through their education. The other route is to consult with a doctor, such as a neurologist and a psychiatrist, and they can also do these types of assessments and identify needs. And also ask the teacher. Teachers are really good at saying, hey, there's a problem here, and resource teachers particularly, they really can help out with identifying needs by doing some preliminary testing. And they need to be very specific. Otherwise, we're going to set children up for failure. And we'll talk more about this later. An example might be, they need accommodations for writing a test. That's very general, not specific, versus they need a quiet, separate room for test writing. See the difference? We need to be specific with our needs. Then we set the direction, the most important accommodations and strategies. We need to decide what they're going to be, and we're going to set a direction. We don't want to take on everything. That's going to shut people down. And should it be a behavior plan or one that focuses on learning strategies, or a combination of multiple directions if the student or the child is able to handle it? But be cautious to not include too many needs and directions, as this can reduce success if the process is overwhelming. It's very important. Then we're going to create a plan, and you usually use recommendations from psychologists, doctors, teachers, parents, and most importantly, the student. It should be a cooperative document, and it is important to include the student if possible. For example, we had in Emily's, my youngest, IPP strategy for writing. We thought she might be stuck, so had her practice writing without stopping because we thought it was an obsessive compulsive thing. We had a scribe involved, and those were a few strategies that we tried, and they didn't help. And she said they wouldn't help, but she was only in grade 3 and couldn't voice what she needed. But through a process of trying things, implementing a plan, and asking for feedback from teachers and Emily, we finally stumbled upon the realization that she was hypersensitive to noises in writing time, so she needed to wear headphones to play the calm music of her choice, and it changed everything. All of a sudden, she was writing up a storm. So in this process, I think you can see we have to review constantly, and we have to constantly revise the plan. If things aren't working, things need to change. It's still information, and good information. So it's a very important part of having a successful plan. Regular reviews and revisions. And lastly, probably the most important reason for documenting everything is transition planning. And it's really critical for a student for success for the following year. And new teachers or schools can use the information to help that student succeed. So transition planning is a big one. Unfortunately, there are reasons that transition plans are not followed, and I'm going to discuss a couple of them. So a change in staff can be problematic. That's the first one. They may not have had time to familiarize themselves with the issues. And this happened to my oldest son when he went to the University of Calgary. In the summer, he worked out a plan with his counselor based on previous successful strategies that were developed in high school. And Graham had a tendency to melt down and wreck things when overwhelmed. And if this happened, the strategy was to head straight to the resource center, where they would find him a quiet room and he could tear apart Kleenex boxes, which is a lot better than destroying chairs or computers or anything like that, until he calmed down. Before his first quiz, there was a misunderstanding with the TA about the use of a calculator, and Graham started to melt down. So he abruptly left the room, headed to the resource center like he'd been told to do. But there had been several staff changes made since the strategies had been implemented, unknown to us. And the staff at the center told him he would get a 0 on his test since his behavior was inappropriate. He should not have left abruptly. It was rude, according to them, which only made things worse. And I ended up going to the center to help calm things down. And once they realized why he had left, to avoid any potential physical outbursts, such as throwing or destroying things in the classroom, and that the plan was written down in his file, and that Graham had done exactly what was expected of him, he was offered a chance to write the quiz another day. There were no further issues for the entirety of his education, and Graham successfully completed not only a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree as well. So everything was fine because everything had been documented. So it's so important to have that documentation. A second reason that I have found personally is that teachers may not read the plan because they have this idea from these well-known studies that show that if a teacher is told random students will do well, they treat these students differently, even though they don't mean to, and it results in better success. And so teachers perceive the opposite to be true as well, that if they know a kid has issues, that will result in the student not doing well. But what this belief is missing is that the plan includes strategies that help that student become successful, and that not adhering to the plan can result in problematic behavior. And for example, when Emily was in elementary school, and no, this is not Emily, she had several years of excellent IPPs and transition strategies in place, smooth as anything. Some of the strategies related to her shutting down when frustrated with writing assignments, and her grade 6 teacher had purposely decided that she would not read the IPP because of her fear of negative bias towards the students with IPPs. The first week of school, on a Friday, Emily came home crying and not wanting to return to school. I found out that she had shut down during a writing assignment, and because the teacher was unaware of the previous successful strategies used, she kept Emily in after school to finish her writing. Of course, she was in complete meltdown, so never was able to even start. So this teacher thought she had her best interest at heart. She was not a bad teacher or a bad person. She just needed to learn the value of reading an IPP and not thinking that an IPP means bad kid. Remember, the IPP is supposed to be a positive and growing document. The last thing that I've heard from parents as well as students is not recognizing parents and teachers. Parents and teachers will say to me, what's the point? They're a waste of time. The teacher doesn't follow it. The student doesn't improve. I've given a few examples of why the IPP is important, and I will now, in a few moments at least, look at specific examples of what makes a good versus a bad IPP, and why some teachers get frustrated and say they're a waste of time, and why parents say, well, they never get followed. So I want to talk a little bit more about parental involvement. And this is really important because individual program plans need to have parents involved as well as the student. And if you get sent an email or in the mail with the expectation that you're just going to sign it and return it, it's not following Alberta education requirements. Notice it says that schools are required to obtain informed written consent from parents to indicate agreement with the IPP, but not only that, ensure parents have information needed to make informed decisions. So you need to be part of this progress. I sent my kids' IPPs back often several times before all parties were satisfied. So it's back and forth, back and forth. And I just want to also emphasize, try to assume good faith. I know sometimes it gets very frustrating. I really tried hard to have conversations and not arguments, though at times I have to admit, I kind of wanted to get angry. It's important for teachers to listen to parents, and equally as important for parents to listen to teachers. Will you get frustrated? Probably. I certainly did. Then it's time to call a friend, talk to a significant other, etc., before reacting. Have someone proofread an email before you send it, or practice what you will say before a phone call. It's important to keep the dialogue moving forward. Now, just briefly, I'm just going to show you what a sample IPP template looks like. This is from the Alberta website. This was made in 2006, so don't be surprised if your school has one that looks a lot different. And I'm going to focus more on this last page here, where it focuses on, the short-term objectives, assessment procedures, progress review, but most importantly, and I think this is the most important part, is the accommodations and strategies, especially for transition planning. This is where the things that don't work and do work will be found. So somewhere in the document, you need to have that. Now, here's something to remember when looking at your IPP, your kids' IPP. It's called SMART, and I like it. It's simple. You have specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound goals. And I really like to focus on those first three, the specific, measurable, and achievable. We need them to be successful. We need to allow for success. If we have an IPP that's set up for failure, we're not going to do so well. So let's take a look at some good, bad, and ugly ones. So calculator will learn to self-advocate. And I have to say, this was probably my biggest pet peeve for my kids. I heard this and I saw it written too many times. What does this mean? What does learning to self-advocate? How do we measure this? Remember I said, you need to be able to measure it. You need to have success. While self-advocacy is important, if symptoms are bad, the student may be incapable of doing this. In fact, I had to get a letter from our psychologist for my daughter in grade 8 because the self-advocacy issue was mentioned so often and in general terms. How do you measure if Cal has learned to self-advocate? What exactly does this look like? This is so broad. Does he just have to ask for an extension on homework once? Is this fulfilled? Or did the teacher mean he has to take ownership of asking for help at all times, or something in between, or something different than this? We really just don't know. Calculator will self-advocate for himself twice by the end of December. Okay, getting a bit better, but still, what do they mean by self-advocacy? We need something specific. Calculator will email his teacher once before the end of October to practice asking for extra time on a test. This one is much better. Do you see how it's very specific? It's easily measured. How do you measure it? You have an email that was sent to the teacher. And the student gets to see that improvement because they've never done it before. So self-advocacy, like most skills, often needs to be taught to everybody, not just kids with TS and OCD. And the IPP, as it should also include strategies listed for the student to try to write this appropriate email. Clear guidelines are needed. In fact, my eldest still needed help with this type of advocacy in first year university. And the resource center was excellent at helping him draft emails to teachers. They would sit down with him and say, okay, this is your first step, second step, third step. And by the end of university, he was able to do it on his own. So clear guidelines, clear goals. All right, sample 2. Android will improve her writing skills over the course of a year. I would think this would be expected for one thing. Most students improve their skills over that year. While this can be measured, what will be done with the measurements? What do they mean? How much improvement do we want? How big is that improvement? So it's hard to quantify. So let's get a little bit better. Android will write one paragraph that includes a thesis statement and includes no spelling mistakes. Now, the reason that I don't like this one, particularly if Anne had obsessive compulsive disorder, is having no spelling mistakes will be very anxiety provoking and will probably cause her to have no writing happen. So it's probably not a good idea to be that specific. So we have to be careful, always have to be careful, because we don't want failure to be guaranteed. So Android will learn to write a paragraph with an introduction, supporting details, and a conclusion with no more than 3 spelling mistakes by the end of October. I would even argue that we don't even include the spelling mistake issue if they have obsessive compulsive disorder. However, if it's not OCD that we're worried about, but we just want improvement, ask the student, how many mistakes do you think you're going to make for improvement? And if they say, oh, I'm going to have 500 mistakes, you can talk to them and say, that's not realistic. Or they're going to say no mistakes. Well, how realistic is that? It's not very realistic. So maybe they choose 2 or 5 or something like that. Involve the student. And as I stated in previous examples, specific strategies should also be included, such as allowing the use of a computer or iPad, providing a checklist of writing skills, providing access to a dictionary, and teaching how to use said dictionary, providing specific strategies if the student gets stuck. And if you want more OCD strategies, you can see my other talk with OCD, and so on. Now, merry-go-round, sample 3, has 3 chances to hand in the homework, or she will get a 0. This is one that my kids really had trouble with. They all have ADHD, plus Tourette syndrome, plus OCD, plus everything. And so while this is measurable, it does not set up for success. And my kids had this problem. They would finish their homework, forget about it, and then never hand it in. And so we actually had this in their IPP through their junior high and high school, and even in university. So merry-go-round has 3 days from the due date of an assignment to hand it in with reminders from the teacher, which is better. Then the student will get a 0. There's that problem again. We have a punishment instead of an encouragement. And strategies need to be found that allow for improvement and success. We don't want punishment. They're going to get frustrated, shut down. So lastly, merry-go-round has 3 days to hand in the homework from the due date. After that, the parent can scan the homework and email it to the teacher. Now, in modern days, it's kind of nice because a lot of assignments are electronic. So that really helps with this issue. So they can actually just do it and send it right in. However, not all assignments are like that. So this is still something that might be problematic. For example, an art project. And my oldest son even had a plan in place in university for this. And it was really weird because the teachers at university, without exception, were extremely accommodating. I found the junior high teachers not accommodating it with this at all. And so by the time he was in university, I didn't have to scan and email the assignments. It was done by my son, but he was responsible for it. He would hand it in later. Let's go on to the next one. Sample 4. Student will improve metacognitive skills. Yes, this was an actual goal on an IPP of a friend of mine. And how would I measure this? I don't even really know what it means, to be honest. And neither did my friend, who's a very smart lady. Metacognition is, quote, intentional thinking about how to think and learn, end quote. And I don't think I need to elaborate on why this would be extremely difficult to measure. And this was also a case where the parent was not asked to be involved, which was problematic as well. So watch out for IPPs with fancy language that are hard to define. So student will show improvement in written assignments and generate ideas for the assignments in all core subjects by March 1st. These are all random dates that I'm just throwing in there. How do you measure this? What does improvement look like? How will the student generate ideas? By thinking about them, writing them down, or recording them. There's too many unknowns here that can really stump a student and a parent and a teacher, all the above. Lastly, student will independently generate 10 ideas about a topic using a tape recorder and use these ideas to generate at least 8 sentences within class time for at least 2 written assignments in all the core subject areas by March 1st. I think you get the idea about being more specific, easily measured, plus a strategy list. So many plans will have strategies and accommodations in separate boxes, which is fine, or they can be included within the main text. It doesn't really matter as long as they're there. So it's really important to keep samples of work to confirm progress and help plan for transitioning to a new grade or school. Samples of pre and post assessments should always be kept. In the previous examples, there were expectations of improvement. And in the last case, for example, it could be stated that a before and after sample from each subject could be collected and used for the student portfolio. Teachers often use a grade level rubric to keep track of this, so it's something they're already doing. And it helps to confirm the plan is working or not, and can help with planning transitions to the next grade or a new school. Remember, if it's not working, that's still information and still important information. So what do you do if an IPP is not allowed? And first of all, you can ask your doctor or psychologist to write a letter about specifics that need to be followed. And I had to do this a few times. And they can explain to the teacher in the school why the accommodations are necessary and what specific accommodations we need to have. And I've already talked about how my kid wouldn't hand in her homework. And what happened is a teacher totally ignored a letter from the psychologist that we had written, and she ignored the IPP and got very angry with me for scanning and sending in the homework. And so what do? Well, I got mad, and my husband read the email before I sent it. And what I did is I emailed the teacher with specifics, cut and paste from the IPP, plus the letter from the psychologist. And it could be from a neurologist or occupational therapist, whoever it may be from. And I copied the administrator. And that worked. She did back down once she realized that she wasn't following the IPP. If problems persist, then request a meeting with the teacher, and this did happen to me a couple times, or the teachers. I liked it when the resource teacher was there. They were usually excellent advocates for the student. So if you have a resource teacher at your school, really make use of them. And even an administrator, I even had the administrator involved on a couple of occasions. If you feel you need help, don't hesitate to bring in a psychologist. I did that a few times, or maybe even Julian. And I've done this for friends for several times. It's just nice to have that support there, just to know, what could help your kid at school. And it's important to remain calm, even when you feel like you're going to pull your hair out. So the last thing, hopefully, if these don't work, hopefully it will never get to here. You can go to the school board. How do you find out? Go to the website, phone them, say, hey, here's my problem. Can you tell me who I should talk to? And just make sure you've got a trail of evidence. You've kept all the emails, you've got all the IPPs, you've got all your evidence. And I'm going to tell you the one time that I've had to recommend to someone to go to the board. A few years ago, I was golfing with a stranger, and I learned in the course of conversing with her that her son had locked himself in his room, was distressed that he had been denied entrance into the University of Calgary engineering program by only 0.5%. And she went on to express her frustration with that English teacher who would not follow the IPP, which stated that he got extra time to hand in written assignments. When her son handed the assignments in, the teacher refused to mark them. And they were back and forth emails between the teacher and the mother with no success. The student received a mark of 55% from the teacher, but scored in the 70s on the diploma exam. I told her that was wrong and could be changed. Since school was out for the summer, I told her to reach out to the school board, send all the paperwork, including the IPPs, the emails from the teacher, and completed assignments that were not marked. She did this, and the mark was changed. He got into engineering and graduated 4 years later, and he is now working. This is why I feel strongly about the importance of IPPs. Without the paperwork, work examples, and emails, this student could have missed this opportunity for success. Now, you might be asking, is this a human rights issue? Is not providing accommodations to students with a known issue, medical or learning, a human right issue? Possibly. But I'm not a lawyer, and most of us would not have the energy or the finances to pursue legal action. But all school boards are aware of the Moore case. On November 9th, 2012, the Supreme Court of Canada handed down a landmark and unanimous 9-0 decision that made school boards across the country pay attention. The North Vancouver School Board had to pay the private school fees that totaled around $100,000 to the Moores. I'm going to very, very briefly go over what the case was. In grade 2, a school psychologist recommended that Jeffrey Moore attend a diagnostic center that helps students with learning disabilities that was part of the North Vancouver School District. The diagnostic center was closed due to a lack of funding. No other alternatives were given, and this was the main reason for the ruling, as I understand it. His parents decided to send him to private school, but thought this was wrong. It should be available at a public school. So they filed a complaint to the BC Human Rights Tribunal, which concluded that what the North Vancouver School Board did was actually discrimination. The BC courts disagreed. They wanted proof that he was treated worse than other students with disabilities. They said there was none. And how sad is that? I think that's quite despicable, actually. And that makes me think that all students with disabilities were not accommodated particularly well. But the Supreme Court of Canada overturned the ruling. Quote, "The finding of discrimination against the district is therefore restored," end quote. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the ruling, which is the purpose of the School Act in British Columbia is to ensure that, quote, "all learners develop their individual potential and acquire the knowledge, skill, and attitudes needed to contribute to a healthy, democratic, and pluralistic society and a prosperous and sustainable economy," end quote. In other words, adequate special education is not a dispensable luxury. This purpose is basically the same in Alberta and most likely in all provinces. And if you want to read more about the story, just look it up. And there's actually been later cases since this that have occurred in other provinces, the US, and other countries, and they've been successful as well. So what can we learn from this? Don't hesitate to speak up in a polite way. Don't hesitate to ask the school for help whenever new issues arise. Most want to help and see their students succeed. Recognize that funding can be a problem, but simple and effective and not necessarily time-consuming and expensive accommodations can be found with creativity and with the help of experts. For example, the Tourette OCD Alberta Network. And recognize that teachers are learning too. They are not necessarily familiar with Tourette syndrome and obsessive compulsive disorder or any other disorder, which leads me to our in-services. Make sure your school holds a free in-service offered by the Tourette OCD Alberta Network. Once teachers see our in-services value, we are repeatedly invited back. These in-services are ready to go to educate students, teachers, parents, and the community. How do you get these amazing free service to your school? Just make sure you contact Julian, who you saw at the beginning, and talk to someone at the school. Julian will take care of the rest. In summary, it's important to meet with the teacher and the resource teacher in later grades to talk about transition before school starts. It's a really important thing to make sure everything's in place. Go over accommodations, go over strategies that did and did not work with the previous teacher. Don't be afraid to ask questions or make suggestions on the IPP. Change it. And remember, it's never static. It's a working document. And it should have measurable goals and should have strategies and accommodations included. While I don't like the term helicopter parent because I think is kind of derogatory, I think for kids with Tourette syndrome and OCD, this parent-teacher communication is really essential. So don't feel badly if you're in contact with the school staff quite a bit. When things aren't working, it's just time to regroup and make a new plan. It's not the end of the world. Just try and remember that. It's hard, especially Tourette syndrome. It keeps changing. So again, the IPP is a working document. If you know that the accommodations and strategies may not work, or that the IPP is a work in progress, when failure happens, they won't be as devastating. since you know you can just keep working towards finding a solution. Likewise, encourage the teacher to reach out when they see things are not working, so that communication keeps on happening. And then just in summary, if the IPP is not followed, hopefully this won't happen, but first email the teacher, copy the principal, then contact the principal, have a meeting, get your doctors, psychologists, the Tourette OCD Alberta network involved. As a last resort, you could consider switching schools. We did that once. I will admit we did that, but I think that teachers and classrooms, et cetera, are better equipped to handle this now. If you need to, go to the board level or the superintendent level, and hopefully you will never have to go to the provincial level.